The locked diary found inside the antique desk, a Miss Marple mystery. Hi there, welcome back to Haunting Vales. Tonight's mystery begins with an antique desk, newly delivered and seemingly ordinary, until a hidden compartment is discovered deep within its drawers. Inside lies a small diary, tightly locked, its pages yellowed with age and its clasp worn smooth by anxious hands. No one in the village claims ownership, yet everyone seems strangely unsettled by its existence. As curiosity turns to unease, Miss Marple notices the little details others dismiss: the desk's previous owners, the careful way the diary was concealed, and the sudden concern of those who insist it should remain unopened. Whatever is written inside was never meant to be read, and someone went to great lengths to ensure it stayed that way. Because some secrets are not hidden to be forgotten, but to be feared. Before we unlock the truth hidden inside the diary, don't forget to subscribe for more haunting Miss Marple mysteries on Haunting Vales. Chapter 1: The locked diary found inside the antique desk. The antique desk arrived in St. Mary Mead on a morning that seemed entirely ordinary, the sort of pale, quiet day when nothing of consequence was expected to happen. Yet such days, as Miss Marple often reflected, were precisely the ones that concealed the greatest disturbances beneath their calm surface. The desk was delivered to the small sitting room of Rosewood Cottage, wrapped in thick cloth and smelling faintly of old wood and dust, its legs carved with a care that spoke of another century. It had belonged to the late Colonel Arthur Bellamy, a man remembered kindly by the village for his punctual habits and upright posture, and the desk had been left to his niece Clara, who now stood uncertainly beside it, as though unsure whether she had inherited a piece of furniture or a burden of history. The desk itself appeared unremarkable at first glance, though Miss Marple's eyes, trained by years of observation rather than any official study, lingered on the way the drawers sat just slightly too tight, and on the polished surface where one corner bore the faintest mark of repeated pressure, as if a hand had rested there often and with purpose. Clara Bellamy spoke nervously as she explained that her uncle had been a private man, devoted to his routines, and that she had never once seen him write anything personal, yet she could not rid herself of the sense that something remained unfinished. Miss Marple listened politely, her knitting needles moving in a steady rhythm, while her mind wandered not through speculation but through memory, recalling how often respectability had served as a careful mask. It was Clara who first noticed that one drawer would not open. She tugged gently, then more firmly, and finally stopped, embarrassed by the small act of impatience. Miss Marple rose at once, placing her knitting aside, and approached the desk with a curiosity that was calm rather than eager. She pressed her fingers along the underside of the drawer, then paused, her gaze thoughtful, before applying the slightest pressure to a hidden catch so cleverly placed that it seemed part of the wood itself. The drawer slid open with a sound that was not quite a creak, more a reluctant sigh, as though the desk had resisted this moment for many years. Inside the drawer lay a narrow compartment, and within it, wrapped in faded brown paper and tied with a thin cord, was a small book bound in dark leather. The leather was cracked with age, and the edges of the pages were uneven, as though cut by hand rather than machine. There was no title on the cover, no name written within, only a small brass lock fastened at the side, its key conspicuously absent. Clara gasped softly, her face paling, while Miss Marple regarded the object with an expression that was neither surprised nor pleased, but rather gently resigned, as though she had always expected such a thing to exist. The diary, for that was clearly what it was, carried with it a weight that could not be measured by size alone. Miss Marple had seen many such items over the years, though rarely in so literal a form, for people often locked away their truths not in books but in habits, glances, and silences. She took the diary carefully, noting the smoothness of the leather where it had been handled repeatedly, and the worn corner where a thumb had rested, perhaps in moments of hesitation or fear. The lock was simple yet sturdy, designed not to deter a determined thief but to slow the owner's own resolve. Clara asked whether it should be opened, her voice trembling with uncertainty, and Miss Marple replied that such decisions were rarely as simple as they appeared. A locked diary, she observed mildly, was not merely a collection of words but an intention, a deliberate choice to conceal. One must consider not only what might be learned, but what might be lost in the knowing. Yet even as she spoke, Miss Marple was aware that the discovery had already begun to unsettle the village, for secrets, once found, have a way of announcing themselves without a single word being read. News travelled quickly in St. Mary Mead, and by the afternoon, the antique desk had become the subject of hushed conversations at the post office and knowing looks exchanged over teacups. Colonel Bellamy had been a figure of quiet authority, trusted and respected, and the idea that he might have kept a locked diary stirred a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. Miss Marple, walking home through the familiar lanes, could sense the shift in the air, that subtle tightening that occurred whenever the village felt itself on the brink of revelation. That evening, Clara returned, carrying the diary wrapped once more in its paper, and confessed that she could not keep it in her house. The presence of the locked book, she said, made her uneasy, as though the walls themselves were listening. Miss Marple accepted the diary without comment, placing it in a drawer of her own writing table, a location chosen not for secrecy but for respect. She spent the night reflecting not on how to open the lock, but on why it had been closed in the first place. In the days that followed, small details began to surface, each insignificant on its own, yet together forming a pattern that Miss Marple found difficult to ignore. The vicar mentioned that Colonel Bellamy had once missed a Sunday service, an event so rare that it had been quietly noted at the time. The shopkeeper recalled a late evening visit, the Colonel purchasing stationery with an urgency that seemed out of character. A neighbor remembered seeing a light in the study window well past midnight, the silhouette within remaining motionless for hours. Miss Marple listened, nodded, and filed each memory away, aware that truth often revealed itself not in grand confessions but in the accumulation of small inconsistencies. The diary remained unopened, its lock intact, yet its influence spread through the village like an unspoken question. Clara avoided social gatherings, fearful of speculation, while others grew bolder, suggesting that perhaps the diary contained nothing of importance at all, and that the mystery lay only in the imagination. Miss Marple knew better. She had learned long ago that imagination, when shared by many, often sharpened into insight. One afternoon, as she sat by the window with her knitting, Miss Marple examined the diary once more, this time paying close attention to the lock itself. There were faint scratches around the keyhole, evidence of past attempts to open it, abandoned or interrupted. The realization struck her gently but firmly that Colonel Bellamy had intended to unlock the diary at some point, and had been unable to do so, not for lack of a key, but perhaps for lack of courage. The thought filled Miss Marple with a quiet sadness, for she understood all too well how people postpone difficult truths, convincing themselves there would always be time. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the room, Miss Marple reflected that the desk had not merely contained the diary, but had guarded it, waiting patiently for the moment when it would be found. The village, so fond of its certainties, had been presented with an object that challenged them, a reminder that even the most respectable lives could conceal chapters never meant to be read aloud. The locked diary rested on the table beside her, silent and unyielding, and Miss Marple knew, with the calm certainty born of experience, that its secrets would not remain hidden for long, for the past, once disturbed, has an unerring way of insisting on its own voice. Chapter 2: The Secrets Written in Shadow. The decision to open the diary was not made in haste, nor was it made aloud. It settled upon Miss Marple quietly, like dust upon an undisturbed shelf, inevitable and patient. She had lived long enough to know that secrets, once discovered, exerted a peculiar pressure upon those who held them, and that resisting such pressure required either great strength or great foolishness. On the third morning after the diary had come into her keeping, she laid it upon the small writing table by the window, where the light was clear and honest, and regarded it as one might regard an old acquaintance whose true nature had only just begun to reveal itself. The lock proved less formidable than it appeared. Miss Marple did not resort to force, nor to any elaborate contrivance, but instead examined the mechanism with the same attentive calm she might apply to a difficult knitting pattern. There was wear within the keyhole, subtle but telling, and after a moment's reflection she selected a slender hairpin from a small dish, manipulating it with delicate precision. The lock yielded with a faint click that sounded almost apologetic, as though it had been waiting for this moment and felt relief at its arrival. Miss Marple paused, her hand resting on the cover, aware that once opened, the diary would no longer belong solely to the past. The first pages revealed nothing of consequence, or so it seemed. They were filled with neat, restrained entries, recording weather, appointments, and trivial observations. The writing was careful and disciplined, the hand of a man accustomed to order and routine. Yet Miss Marple sensed that this was a deliberate beginning, a facade constructed to reassure the writer himself that what followed could be contained. She read on patiently, attentive not only to the words but to the spaces between them, the pauses where ink had hesitated. Gradually, the tone shifted. Dates were still noted, but the entries grew longer, less precise, the handwriting occasionally slanting as though the writer's thoughts had begun to outpace his control. Colonel Bellamy wrote of sleepless nights, of an unease he could not name, and of a sense that the village he had known for decades was changing in ways he could not quite define. He mentioned familiar faces, neighbors greeted daily, yet described them with a faint suspicion that seemed almost alien to his previous certainty. Miss Marple recognized this progression at once, for she had seen it many times before in people who began to notice that the world no longer aligned with their expectations. Then, without warning, the diary revealed its true purpose. In an entry dated nearly 5 years earlier, the Colonel wrote of a discovery made by accident, something seen at the wrong moment, overheard when silence had been assumed. He did not specify what this discovery was, only that it involved someone he had trusted implicitly. His language grew guarded, as though even on paper he feared the consequences of naming what he knew. Miss Marple felt a tightening in her chest, not from excitement, but from the familiar sadness of understanding how such knowledge could isolate a person completely. As the entries continued, a pattern emerged. The Colonel began to describe a series of small, unsettling events, each insignificant on its own, yet together forming a chain of implication. Missing items, conversations abruptly ended, expressions that shifted too quickly to be innocent. He wrote of confronting no one, choosing instead to observe, to confirm his suspicions before acting. Miss Marple noted this choice carefully, for it revealed a man torn between duty and fear, aware that truth, once spoken, could not be returned to silence. One entry in particular caught her attention, not for its content, but for its absence. Several pages had been torn out cleanly, leaving behind a faint ridge where the paper had once been bound. The following entry resumed abruptly, the handwriting noticeably altered, heavier and less controlled. The Colonel wrote of regret, of a mistake he could not undo, and of a sense that he was no longer merely an observer, but a participant in events that were spiraling beyond his control. Miss Marple closed the diary briefly at this point, allowing herself a moment to consider the significance of what had been removed. Pages were not torn out lightly, especially by a man so careful in his habits. The diary went on to describe a growing fear, one that manifested not as panic but as vigilance. The Colonel wrote of securing his belongings, of double-checking locks, and of keeping the diary hidden within the desk, altering the compartment himself to ensure it would not be discovered easily. He acknowledged the irony of recording his fears in an object he was determined to conceal, yet he seemed unable to stop writing, as though the act itself provided a fragile sense of control. Miss Marple found herself reading more slowly now, aware that each sentence carried weight. The Colonel wrote of considering whether to destroy the diary altogether, and of deciding against it, convinced that the truth, however dangerous, must be preserved somewhere. He expressed a belief that circumstances would one day change, that someone else might be better placed to act upon what he had learned. The entry ended with a single line, written with uncharacteristic force, stating that silence could be as harmful as any lie. As daylight faded, Miss Marple reached the final pages. The last entries were brief and fragmented, written over several weeks, and suggested a man under considerable strain. He wrote of feeling watched, of an unspoken tension in ordinary interactions, and of a certainty that his time to act was slipping away. The final entry, dated only days before his death, was the most restrained of all. It contained no accusation, no revelation, only a quiet acknowledgement that he had waited too long, and that others would now have to decide what to do with what he had left behind. Miss Marple closed the diary gently, her expression thoughtful. She did not feel triumph, nor even satisfaction, but a deepening sense of responsibility. The diary had not provided a neat answer, nor had it identified a culprit, yet it had illuminated something far more important, the presence of a concealed truth that had shaped the final years of a man's life. She understood now why the diary had been locked, and why it had been hidden so carefully. It was not merely to protect its contents, but to protect the fragile balance of the village itself. That evening, as Miss Marple sat alone with her thoughts, she considered the implications of what she had read. The diary suggested wrongdoing, certainly, but also fear, hesitation, and the corrosive effect of secrecy. Whoever was involved had relied upon silence, upon the assumption that respectability would shield them from scrutiny. Miss Marple knew that such assumptions were often correct, and that was precisely why they were so dangerous. Outside, the village settled into its usual quiet, lights glowing warmly behind drawn curtains. To any observer, St. Mary Mead remained unchanged, a place of comforting routine and familiar faces. Yet Miss Marple knew that beneath this surface lay questions that could no longer be ignored. The diary, now unlocked and read, had shifted something fundamental, and the shadows it revealed would soon demand attention. She placed the diary back into its wrapping, aware that the next step would require not only intelligence, but courage, for the truth, once pursued, had a way of unsettling everyone it touched, including those who sought it most earnestly. Chapter 3: The Truth the Diary Tried to Hide. Miss Marple did not act at once after reading the diary, for she had learned through long experience that haste was the enemy of understanding. Instead, she allowed the words she had read to settle in her mind, arranging themselves not as accusations but as patterns, much like stitches in a piece of careful needlework. The diary had not named a crime, yet it had described a fear too sustained and deliberate to be dismissed as imagination. Colonel Bellamy had been a disciplined man, not prone to fancies, and the quiet desperation evident in his final entry suggested a danger that had pressed upon him steadily, day after day, until it had become part of his existence. She began, as she always did, with people rather than theories. Over tea with neighbors, during casual conversations that appeared entirely harmless, she listened more than she spoke. She observed how certain names prompted hesitation, how some villagers grew overly animated when the colonel was mentioned, while others fell abruptly silent. One name, in particular, surfaced repeatedly, never directly associated with wrongdoing, yet always accompanied by a subtle tightening of expression. It belonged to Edward Hawthorne, a man of agreeable manners and long-standing respectability, who had assisted the colonel with various personal affairs in his later years. Edward Hawthorne, Miss Marple noted, was precisely the sort of individual who thrived on trust. He was helpful without being intrusive, attentive without appearing curious, and had positioned himself as indispensable. The diary entries that spoke of misplaced documents and altered routines aligned uncomfortably well with Edward's increasing presence in the Colonel's life. Miss Marple recalled how often harm came not from obvious malice, but from quiet opportunism, nurtured patiently beneath the cover of good intentions. The final confirmation came not through confrontation, but through a small inconsistency. Miss Marple paid a visit to Edward's home under the pretense of returning a book the Colonel had once borrowed. During their conversation, Edward mentioned an event described in the diary, a private conversation the Colonel had insisted no one else had known about. The realization was immediate and unmistakable. Edward had known details that could only have come from direct involvement, or from access he had never acknowledged. Miss Marple left without accusation, her manner as gentle as ever, but her conclusions were firmly in place. The diary had not been written to condemn, but to preserve truth until the moment someone was prepared to see it clearly. She returned home and read the final pages once more, understanding now the full weight of the Colonel's regret. He had discovered that Edward had been manipulating financial documents, gradually redirecting small sums, amounts insignificant enough to avoid suspicion, yet substantial over time. When confronted indirectly, Edward had responded not with denial, but with an unspoken threat, reminding the Colonel of reputations, of scandal, and of how easily a respected name could be tarnished by rumor alone. The Colonel's failure had not been one of morality, but of timing. He had waited, hoping to gather proof sufficient to protect the village from upheaval, and in doing so, had allowed fear to delay justice. The diary was his final attempt to ensure that his silence did not become complicity. Miss Marple recognized this with deep sympathy, for she understood how often people convinced themselves that patience was prudence, when it was merely avoidance dressed in sensible clothing. When the matter was quietly presented to the proper authorities, supported by the diary and corroborated by careful examination of records, Edward Hawthorne did not protest. His composure fractured only briefly, enough to confirm what words could not. The village absorbed the revelation with a mixture of disbelief and subdued relief, for while scandal was unwelcome, uncertainty was worse. Life in St. Mary Mead resumed its familiar rhythms, altered only by a heightened awareness that appearances, however comforting, were never guarantees of virtue. Miss Marple returned the diary to its wrapping and placed it back inside the antique desk, restoring the hidden compartment with the same care the Colonel himself had once taken. Some truths, she believed, did not need to be displayed, only acknowledged. The diary had fulfilled its purpose, not by exposing every detail, but by guiding the right eyes toward the right conclusions. As she sat once more by her window, knitting in hand, Miss Marple reflected that the locked diary had been less about secrets than about responsibility. It had asked a question rather than provided an answer, leaving it to the future to decide whether truth would be faced or ignored. In this instance, truth had been chosen, quietly and without drama, which Miss Marple felt was as it should be. If you've enjoyed unraveling this mystery and wish to continue exploring stories where the smallest details conceal the greatest truths, be sure to support the channel by liking the video, sharing it with fellow mystery lovers, and subscribing for more classic-style investigations. New mysteries await, and as always, the most revealing clues are often the ones hiding in plain sight.